Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Elisabeth Bik. She's a microbiologist and scientific integrity consultant. And today we're going to talk about mainly the topics of scientific integrity and scientific fraud. So, Dr. Bik, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to have you on.
My pleasure to be here with you, Ricardo.
So let's start perhaps with some definitions or to explain some terms here, some basic terms. So, where is integrity in the context of science?
Well, integrity is about honesty, about truthfully reporting what you have found during your experiments. So, and that is actually, I think, for me, the heart of what science should be. It's about finding the truth. So we do interviews, we research, we are in the lab, we try to cure patients. But I feel when we write our scientific papers about it, we need to truthfully report on what we have found. So basically, it's about honesty and not lying, about really reporting what you found, not leaving out the results you didn't want, not cutting corners, also being ethical in a way to your patients, to your animals that you might use in animal experiments, to your co-authors. Now, usually science integrity is not, it depends a little bit on the definition, but for me, it's this whole range, this whole spectrum of being honest towards your data and your colleagues and your the experiments that you do.
And on the other hand, what is scientific fraud? What counts as scientific fraud?
Well, it's basically cheating and lying. There's different definitions per countries. In the United States, where I live, it's usually one of three things. So there's three types of science fraud that you could look at. So the first one is plagiarism, where you would copy somebody else's text or ideas, but not give credit to the person who was first. So that is one type of misconduct. The second type is falsification, where a person obtains results but changes them a little bit. Let's say a particular patient or a particular experiment had an outcome, but it didn't quite was the outcome you had hoped as a researcher. So you change some of the data and now, oh, suddenly it's a positive or a negative, and that would be falsification. And the third type of misconduct is fabrication, and that is completely making up results. So typing in some numbers in a spreadsheet, making a graph, etc., without actually going in the lab and making and doing measurements and things like that. So completely making up results. So those are the three types of science misconduct. But those are the more extreme types. There's a lot of in between being completely honest and completely fraudulent. There's a lot of gray zone. So usually we call those questionable research practices, where, let's say, you're a little bit sloppy, you don't label your data very well, and so you make an error when you report on the data. And that's a very big middle zone. And it's sometimes very hard to know if a person really had an intention to mislead, which would be misconduct, or was just sloppy. It's very hard to distinguish between those things.
So I also want to understand here what are some of the factors behind scientific fraud, what leads to scientific fraud and stuff like that. So let me start by asking you about perhaps the individual incentives that people might have in science. So what individual incentives actually do scientists have to commit fraud?
Well, we love metrics as scientists, and our bosses love metrics. We love to ask people how many papers did you publish and what was their impact factor and what was their how many times were they cited, your H index, how many of your papers were in Nature or in Science. So scientists, but also the people above them, the institutions, the hiring committees, people who hire new faculty, for example, they love to look at those numbers, those metrics. And yeah, if you don't have very good metrics, if you didn't publish that much, or you weren't cited that much, or your results are just not very nice, so it's hard to publish, it is very tempting to cheat. It's like doping in sports, right? Like if you see everybody using doping and everybody winning, and you're trying to be honest, but you see everybody around you uses doping, or in science is cheating, it's very tempting to also cheat because you see people winning races, you see people in science publishing papers who cheat. And so it is, as long as there's no consequences for cheating and you see a lot of cheating around you, I think other people are starting to cheat. So it depends on your environment. If you grow up as a scientist, if you work in a lab where everybody cheats, you're tempted to do it as well, because otherwise your results are not as great as those folks around you. And yeah, I think we put too much emphasis on positive results, on amazing findings, on numbers, on metrics, and that is ultimately what leads to cheating. But it also differs from country to country. So in some countries, the pressure to publish is higher. There's even money you can earn if you publish a paper. You might get a promotion, and so it depends per country, and that is why we see that in some countries there seems to be a little bit more cheating than in other countries. It's not because those people are more, are better cheaters or bigger cheaters. It's because of these monetary incentives or these other incentive structures that lead people to cheat.
This is also tied, at least to some extent, with career advancements, right? Because since scientists are sort of forced to publish X number of papers per year, depending on the country, and that also has to do with them being able to advance in their career, right?
Yeah, absolutely. If we really hold scientists accountable to how many papers they publish, then people are gonna find ways to make that happen. But in science, you don't always get the results you want. Your cells don't want to grow, or the results are different than you expected. And I feel it's not the right way to measure if a scientist is good. We should not be looking too much at how many papers did you publish and how many were in science. I don't think that necessarily tells you if that person is a better scientist than a person who works slowly and only publishes maybe one paper per 2 years or even longer. Like I think good science needs time. And if we force people to publish once a year, people are going to find creative ways to make that happen, and that might involve cheating.
And do you think that there's anything about how science as an institution is designed that promotes fraud or not?
Yeah, it is because that focus on numbers, and I think most scientists who are successful will have a page saying how many, a list of all their papers and a list of all their citations and all the prizes that they won. And I think this is how society is. That's just the way it is. But I think we focus a little bit too much, and especially when we, let's say, hire. I don't say we because I don't actually hire people, but when people are looking for a new professor at a university, they will look at resumes, and as in any other job, obviously. But we put a lot of focus on how many papers did somebody publish, all these metrics, all these citations, and universities do the same. They love to be the number one in their country. They love, and those lists of what is the best university those lists are often based also on number of citations, numbers of Nobel Prizes a university has won, number of science publications or nature publications. So all of us are in this rat race to look at these numbers, and that is just the way that science is organized. And there's just not enough focus on things like open science, on rigor, on how well we report on our data, not on reproducibility. And those are also very important factors of science. But if you do them as a scientist, if you, let's say, work on really good methods to publish your paper so that other people can reproduce it, or you share all your data, those things cost time and they're not always rewarded by the institution who just focuses on number of publications. Things like mentorship. How do you guide your graduate students through the early phases of their career? Or how many papers did you peer review? Or how many times did you do social outreach or try to go to a pub and explain people about science and how great it is? Those things are often not rewarded for us as scientists. And they're equally good. I feel that those things also make a really great scientist, but it's really hard to put them on your resume and to make them count.
And when it comes to the publication system itself, is the fact that negative results tend to not get published, or at least not as much as the positive ones, also a big problem?
Yes, that is a big problem, and that ties back to reproducibility. But because sometimes there's a publication with amazing findings, and people try to reproduce it, and they want to build on that work. And this is how science works. We build on each other's work, but they cannot seem to get it to work. And I think I've been in that situation, and probably every scientist. You're like, why doesn't the experiment work? And you start to think of yourself as a failure. It's very rare that you think, well, the other people didn't describe it well. You usually will blame it on yourself. I guess I didn't do it correctly. I was just a couple of seconds too late, and that's why the experiment failed, or things like that. So we tend to maybe be ashamed of those results and not publish them. Most journals will not accept them. Journals are looking for novel findings that other people would love to hear about. And it's very hard to publish negative results, to say, well, we couldn't reproduce this, we couldn't make this work. And very often, there's many reasons why experiments don't work. Sometimes it's just this little tiny thing that you didn't think would be important. Let's say the temperature in your room is just 1 degree too hot or too low, or the shaker doesn't shake the same way as the other people shaker, or the ozone concentration in the air is too high and you had no idea that was important. But sometimes it could be fraud. And so there have been a couple of fraud cases where I was involved in, where then later people said, yeah, we could never reproduce that paper. And then you have to think, how many people try to reproduce it? How many people spend money and time and tears trying to make it to work? And that's just such a shame that we don't talk about these things, that we don't have platforms to publish negative results. There's a couple of journals who start to do this, and that's great, but we need more. And yeah, I think 90% of the things we do don't work, and we never publish them. And it's only the 10% that does work that gets published. So there's so much money being wasted on those negative results.
So I would like to ask you a little bit more about citations now. Are there ways by which researchers can artificially increase their citation metrics? And in this particular case, I would like for you to tell us specifically about the case of citation rings.
Right. I mean, you could, of course, always sneak in that one extra paper that is not maybe that relevant to your new paper, and sneak in one of your old papers, and oh, now you have an extra citation. So I think most people cite their own work because like I said before, you build on each other's work and you build on your own work. So sometimes you will say, oh, we did this experiment exactly the way we did it in that older paper. So that would count towards your citations. I've seen papers where people cite, let's say they have 50 citations, 50 references, and 20 of them are from their own lab or from their own. So that is obviously frowned upon, but there's actually no rule, and a reviewer might not even see that. Citation rings, that's a very creative way. So these are, I'm not quite sure how it works, but I think the way it works is that, let's say, a group of people, I don't know, 50 people, 50 researchers form a secret group, and they say we're all going to cite each other's papers. And so it doesn't really get noticed because, these people cite other people's papers, but the other folks in the group cite their papers. And so that way you all increase each other's papers. And sometimes we see these papers where there's a statement, like some general statement, like, I don't know, DNA sequencing has greatly increased something, and then there's 10 references. So between brackets, it said reference 37 to 46 or so, and all those references are from certain authors, and if you really notice that, they might actually not be related to the topic that they're cited in the context of. So it's a way that people sneak in references, and very often these are citation rings, but they're sometimes very hard to recognize. If a person, cites 20 of their own papers, of course we can see that. But if a person cites 20 papers that are not very related and are from that secret pact of these citation rings, it's very hard to notice that.
How about plagiarism? Is there lots of plagiarism in the scientific literature?
Not as much as there was, let's say, in the early 2000s. So I actually started to become a science detective because somebody had plagiarized my work, and I found out about it, and I was very mad. And the paper was, I think, published around maybe 2010 or so. So I found it in 2013. And I think in that time, journals weren't really checking for plagiarism very often. It was starting that there are some tools to check for plagiarism. It's basically a glorified Google search where you just search if somebody else used your text. And so later journals, let's say around maybe 2010 or 2015, journals were starting more and more to use plagiarism checkers. So I think real plagiarism is pretty rare because it gets caught by most journals. And I'm not talking about one or two sentences or a couple of sentences in the methods where you just described how you did a particular standard thing. Those things I don't call plagiarism. I'm talking about complete review articles that were completely plagiarized, or where whole paragraphs were copy pasted. So that is the really bad plagiarism that you don't find very often anymore. But there's novel techniques to hide plagiarism, and in particularly, I need to mention, of course, artificial intelligence, because you can take a paragraph that somebody else has written, and if you're lazy, you just say rewrite that paragraph in using ChatGPT or some other generative AI, and it will generate a new text that is exactly the same as the old, but it's reworded. So you can use your old plagiarism detector tools, and it's not going to flag it as plagiarism. But in reality, it still is. It's still the same text. It's reworded, but especially if you look at references, you can see it's still using the same references. So it is very hard to recognize that. And you can always say, well, I just rewrote it, so it's not plagiarism. But with AI, you can very quickly write an article without doing anything yourself than just copy pasting text that somebody else has written. And so it's increasingly hard to recognize plagiarized text. And yeah, I'm a bit worried about that, but maybe that's just the new tool we have. And maybe we shouldn't worry too much about how we're going to rewrite the same thing again, because there's only so many ways you can say, you can write an introduction, let's say about breast cancer or so. I mean, you're going to use the same terms, you're going to use the same statistics. And so maybe in the end, we shouldn't worry too much about that type of plagiarism. But of course, when it's plagiarism of data, when you just steal somebody else's data or even figures or photos, that is still wrong, of course. But I think when you describe a particular problem in science, a particular, like for the introduction, for example, you would describe, you would give the facts. And so I can sort of see that maybe we shouldn't worry too much about plagiarism. We cannot recognize it anymore. If you're a smart fraudster, you'll just use AI and you're going to rewrite that paragraph.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about how you do your work. I mean, what are the most common ways you discover scientific fraud?
So I focus on images, on photos.
Mm-hmm.
And so I will look at scientific papers and search for duplicated images. Let's say within a paper, there's a bunch of photos, little panels, very often Western blots or photos of tissues or cells. and the same photo is used twice, so it's a duplicated photo, but one is experiment A and one is experiment B, so they should not be the same. That could be a sloppy, of course, a sloppy, the researcher who just grabbed the wrong photo. Sometimes photos overlap, so you see that, let's say, one photo is experiment A, one photo is labeled as a different experiment, experiment B, but there's a little overlap that you can find. And so that looks like it was the same sample. Maybe it was moved under a microscope a little bit. So those are overlapping images, or sometimes images are mirrored or rotated, things like that. And then the third type of image duplication that I look for are photos that within the photo there's duplicated elements. So it's one photo and you see the same cell 3 times, or the same type of tissue copy pasted a couple of times. And yeah, that is, of course, that's very bad because people do that intentionally, maybe to hide a crack, or maybe to make it look like there's more cells growing with this drug, or fewer cells, or things like that. So those are the type of things I'm looking for. I'm using my eyes, but I'm also using tools. And the tools I'm using have databases of images in other papers. So I might be able to find papers that have stolen an image from a different paper, or that the authors just reuse their own photo again and make it look like a different experiment. I need to very carefully look, because sometimes the duplication is quite okay. Sometimes it's quite okay to use the same control experiment. Let's say you test 2 different drugs, and you have, the not treated cells versus drug 1, and then the not treated cells versus drug 2. So the control, the not treated sample might be the same, and that is quite okay. So those are fine. I'm not going to flag those, but I'm trying to find inappropriate duplications.
And what about using fake images? I mean, what kinds of fake images do people use, and where do they get them?
Well, we have seen Western blots that look very unrealistic, and we think they were generated using artificial intelligence. Now, AI has, of course, greatly improved over the last 2 or 3 years. But there was a period where AI was not that good yet, I guess. And we saw these weird blots, and I wasn't the first one seeing it, but many other people had noticed them. And all the Western blots, they look like horizontal stripes, but the background of these blots was always the same. So it was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of papers that all had photos with the same background. And we're like, that is weird. That they have to have a common source. Now, of course, the technique of AI is so much better that you can teach your artificial intelligence. You can just give it a bunch of real photos and say, generate a new photo for me. And I cannot no longer use my software because it's not a duplicated image. It's a novel, unique image. So these are really, really hard to find. And I think all of us have seen photos generated by AI that look very realistic. Sometimes you can still recognize that it's fake, but I think as the technique gets better, it's very easy to generate photos of tissues and cells and even of human faces that are indistinguishable from the real thing. And of course, if you are a science fraudster, you will be very happy with this technique because you no longer have to work in the lab, and you can crank out fake paper after fake paper. So generative AI, especially when it comes to image, when you think about science integrity, I think it allows fraudsters to generate more and more fake papers, and I'm not quite sure how to detect that. And I don't think we're ready for that amount of fraud.
Mm-hmm. So tell us specifically about the case of the rat with the big balls and the enormous penis.
Yes, I wrote a blog post about it. I mean, that was, when was that? Last summer or so? That was a very funny image. It was not a photo, but it was clearly generated by AI because it showed indeed a rat with a giant penis and giant balls. And it was published in a scientific paper in one of the Frontiers journals. I think it was supposed to show how stem cells were isolated from testicles of rats, which, that's a scientific technique, but it wasn't very helpful. First of all, because the anatomic proportions of the rat were quite wrong. I don't think rats have penises like that. It rose into the skies. It was just so big. But also you couldn't, I mean, that was funny, but obviously we were all having a very, good laugh with it, but you couldn't read the labels. It was just, AI cannot really generate letters yet very well. So you couldn't read the letters. It was just funny and not very useful from a scientific point of view. That would not have been that bad. And actually, the authors did disclose they used Mid-Journey, which is one of the generative AI tools to generate images. But also the text of the whole article appeared to have been generated using AI, and they had not disclosed that, and so the paper was retracted. Very quickly, actually, may I add. But it was very funny. We all had a very good laugh about it on Twitter and other social media. I think most scientists probably have seen that image. And I wrote a blog post about it. And so it's good that it was retracted, but it generated a lot of joy, I think, in most people's heart.
Yeah. There are also been cases of fake images of signaling pathways. What is the problem with such fakes?
There's several science fields that have been infected, if you will, with fake images. In a field, there have been many papers that we think have been mass produced by what we call paper mills, and these are fake papers. And in some of the fields in biology, there's, let's say, many different molecules, or there's many different types of cancers. And so you can just write an article and then you change one molecule into another molecule, or you change one cancer into another cancer. But you rewrite the text a little bit so nobody would think it's the same text. But because you have all these different combinations of different molecules or pathways or cancers, it looks like a new paper. And we can almost recognize these by the titles, like inhibition of non-coding RNA 123 by this pathway will decrease cell growth in cancer through this pathway, or something like that. The title structures were very similar. The tadpole paper mill that I referred to earlier, where all the Western blots had exactly the same background, those all had very similar title structures, to the point where you could just see the title and know it was the same group who generated that. And these papers were sold to different authors. These came all from people working in Chinese hospitals. And it was basically the same paper written over and over again, text slightly changed, images slightly changed. But 600 papers that we found to all have use the same template.
And what happens to scientists who are caught committing fraud?
Well, very often almost nothing or nothing, unfortunately. Science is sort of like the Tour de France, the big biking race, where at some point a lot of people used doping and nobody seemed to care, and people were biking faster and faster because they used doping. And if you didn't use doping, you would definitely not win the race, and nobody seemed to care. And of course, at some point, people said, we need to care about the sport. If we really care about biking and, how good is an athlete versus how much doping do they use, we need to check for doping. And so it changed the sport, I think, for the better. But in science, we're not at that stage yet. I think we're starting to realize that there's a lot of fraud, but very little happen. Occasionally, a paper gets retracted, but it's not enough. And especially the serial fraudsters, the people who have produced multiple papers with fraud, those folks seem to very often not get punished in any way. There's very little consequences. Sometimes, especially when it's a senior researcher, they usually will blame their junior research assistant or grad student, and maybe those folks get fired. But the senior person keeps on frauding. That's what we see. Papers often don't get retracted or even corrected. Authors come up with all kinds of stories trying to explain why this cell is visible twice or 3 times or 100 times in the same photo, and the editors believe it and they just issue a correction. It seems that nobody, at least until a couple of years ago, that editors and journals and publishers didn't really realize how big of a problem it had become. Now they are starting to realize, but it's there has been a time where people were too naive, and institutions seem to also do very little. They very often senior research bring in a lot of money, so an institution might have to decide, like, okay, are we going to, let's say, fire the fraudulent professor, or are we going to keep him or her on because they bring in so much money, so many grants, and I think that a lot of universities will just tell the fraudulent person, oh, don't fraud anymore, or fraud better, at least that we cannot catch you, and because they really love, of course, the money that some of these professors bring in, and they have high publication records, and that makes the university end up higher in their rankings, and we all love the rankings, and it's just there's so much conflict of interest. You want these folks to be, leave science, please, and don't fraud anymore. But in reality, these people are not held accountable, and they keep on frauding, and there's too many examples of that.
So let me ask you just a little bit about retraction. When are papers retracted? And I mean, how many among the ones that should be retracted really get retracted?
Oh, yeah. So taking a step back, a scientific paper, once it is peer-reviewed and published, and somebody finds an error in it, there's several things that can be done then to the paper. So the first one is a correction. It can be called an erratum or a corrigendum, but it's basically all the same thing. That is usually used, let's say there's a small error, two little photos were switched, or there's a misspelling in the name of one of the authors. That happens a lot. Or they forgot to add, I don't know, the funder wasn't mentioned, or things like that. Small errors that don't really influence the paper. And then there can be an expression of concern, which is it's very often a temporary thing, and it's good because it tells you if the publishers puts that on the paper, it knows it's usually because there's an ongoing investigation or there are some bigger errors. We're still thinking about it, but at least in the meantime, we're warning the readers that there's a problem. And then the most severe step that can happen to a paper is a retraction. So the paper will remain online. It's not that it's removed from the interwebs. It will be labeled usually with a watermark, retracted, or like a big red sign at the top. You can still read it. But basically it tells you that the publisher or the journal editor no longer has faith in the journal. And it's very often for a fatal flaw. It could be because one of the authors found that one of the calculations was completely wrong, completely changing the outcome. So it can be started by an author who says, sorry, we found a big error. We're going to retract the paper. We're going to redo the experiments, republish it maybe. And I think that is great, where the authors actually recognize that there was a big error and retract the paper. But most often it is because of all kinds of suspicions of misconduct or big errors. Let's say there's many image panels that overlap, manipulated photos, duplications to the extent where you no longer have trust in the data. And that is often by whistleblowers, by external people, maybe by me. When I see a big problem in a paper, I will write to the editors, and then the editors will perhaps decide to retract the paper. Now, it doesn't happen as often as I would like to see it. Initially, when I started to do this work, I had a set of 800 papers in which I found problems. I wrote to the editors, and not all of these should be retracted, obviously. Some were small errors, but only 1/3 was either corrected or retracted after waiting 5 years and sending a reminder. And so 5 years seems a very long time to take a decision if a paper, should be corrected or retracted. So only 1/3 of these papers have been taken action on. And now we're in about 10 years later, it's only a little bit more than a half of the papers have either correction or retraction. So it's very slow. And in half of the cases, even after waiting 10 years, nothing happens. And it's so frustrating because we see a big problem in a paper and the journals look the other way. And that is bad. If you know that your airbag of your car is faulty, you would hope that there's a recall and that you don't have to pressure the car manufacturer to get a new car or to get it fixed. And it seems that publishers in many cases, and there's good exceptions, there's good publishers who really do the right thing, but there's too many publishers who don't seem to care about quality control. They publish bad papers, and then when people complain about it, the customer service is also very bad. And it will be like buying a very expensive car, realizing there's a problem, and then the dealer not wanting to take any action. I think as customers of buying, people who bought a car, you would not accept that. But in science, we seem to all be okay with that, and we should not be okay because we pay the publishers a lot of money. And I'm not quite sure where all that money goes to, but it doesn't seem to go to quality control or customer service. So that needs to change. And again, there are good publishers who do the right thing, but there's still too many who are too focused on making money and not on quality control and customer service.
And in the meantime, while we wait for the paper to get corrected or retracted, it can be cited several times.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a very good point. The reader might not know that there's a big problem with this paper. If I write to the editor, none of the readers would know there's a big problem. And that is why most people who work like me, who find problems in papers, we will post on a website called pubpeer.com, like publication and peer review, pubpeer. And we will flag papers for all kinds of problems. So if you do a literature search, you can type in the DOI, the unique identifier of a paper, and you can see if somebody else has seen something about the paper. It could be a positive comment or a negative comment. Now, most comments on Papier are about image problems because they're visible, right? Like it's very easy to see that a photo is duplicated. It's much easier to see than that a bar graph has been made up. Like that is very often, if you are a good fraudster, that would not be visible. But we want to warn the readers of these papers that there's particular problems. As soon as I can find it, I will post it on Papier. So within 5 minutes, it's on Papier. While retractions take, sometimes 10 years, and that is just too slow. Like, why would it take so long? And so it's frustrating. And all this time, people might think that the paper is completely fine. They might not realize that there's potential problems with it. So it's a very good point, and that is why we science detectives are very often frustrated with the lack of response.
So I have one final question/topic I would like to explore with you here today. So what do you think are the best solutions here? How can we best combat fraud?
Yeah, it's a big question, right? There's multiple things you can think of. Of course, we need to educate young people, at the start of their science career, what is acceptable, what is okay, what are things you should not be doing. That is one thing. I think education is important, but I think at the same time, there need to be consequences for science fraud. There need to be quicker corrections and retractions. There need to be a lower threshold for science fraud. Like if you find a photoshopped image, you should not allow the authors to send in a completely new set of figures. That would be, winning the Tour de France, testing positive for doping, and saying, well, just bring in a clean sample in 2 weeks and we're all good. No, that is just, no, that paper should be retracted. There should be bigger consequences for people who have been caught doing fraud by their institutions and funders. people who they should not receive any funding for the next future. And some of these things happen occasionally, but it seems too little, too late, too slow. So consequences, education, those I think are the most important things. And I think we also need to focus more on open science, sharing your data set, sharing negative results, publishing negative results, and maybe doing science a little bit more slowly, being able to show that that experiments are reproducible. And sometimes I dream about a new way of science publishing where we publish smaller experiments, one figure, and then other people can reproduce that and then say, yes, we were able to exactly get the same results, or no, we could not do it. Maybe, am I missing something? Are there certain experimental conditions you didn't include or so? As a way maybe to slow down science a little bit, but make it more reproducible and reliable. And I think we should just focus more on that. But it's so easy to focus on metrics and publications, and how are we going to change our complete system? It's probably not going to happen anytime soon. But I think we need to think about other ways of publishing our papers and rewarding reproducibility and negative result publishing.
Great. So, Dr. Bik, just before we go, where can people find you and your work on the internet?
Well, I was on Twitter, X, but now I switched to Blue Sky. So Elisabeth Bik, my name. You should be able to find me on Blue Sky. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Science Integrity Digest. That is my blog. And usually very responsive. Usually on Blue Sky, that's where you'll have the biggest chance of finding me. And if I don't follow you, just ask me if I can follow you, so you can send me a direct message, and then I'll share my email address and we can talk.
Great. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been really fun and a real pleasure to talk with you.
Same here. Thank you, Ricardo. And I hope everybody will stay very honest.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingford, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht, A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.